This is a U.S.-China media brief produced by the UCLA Asian American Studies Center. The U.S.-China media brief features interviews with experts and other prominent individuals involved in studying and documenting the dynamic and ever-evolving relationship between the United States of America and the People's Republic of China. I'm Russell Leong, Director of the U.S.-China Media Brief of the UCLA Asian American Studies Center.
Now, when you talk about the Chinese South Africans, you're talking about the descendants of the earlier migrants to South Africa who came in the, 1870s or so?
Started in the late 1870s into the 1880s, and the movements were quite fluid. There was quite a lot of back and forth movement through the first part of the 20th century, where people would, usually young men, would come out, try to set up a business. I mean, in patterns that were very similar to what occurred in California or in other parts of the Americas as well. The point at which the history of the Chinese South Africans shifted drastically from what occurred to Chinese in the Americas or in Australia was at apartheid. So at the point that the communists won in mainland China and separated by a year from the year when the Nationalist Party won the elections in South Africa. So that's when kind of the experiences diverged quite drastically.
Now, for the our listeners, can you give us some idea of the way terms are used, whether in class terms or racialized terms, for instance, Asiatic, colored, white in South Africa, in terms of how they have been used to define the Chinese during different periods?
The Chinese, if they weren't referred to as Chinese, were often lumped with Indians as Asiatics, and this is a historic term that I think has only been used in South Africa. That term has fallen by the wayside. During the apartheid period and even before, Chinese were legally classed as non-white. And during apartheid, depending on which laws we're speaking about, they were variously classed as either Chinese or colored or simply non-white. So those were kind of the legal classifications. What's unique about the Chinese South African situation is that because they were such a small community, they were often granted concessions or privileges that other non-white groups were not. And so gradually, from the 1950s and into the 60s and 70s, the Chinese became known as honorary white, even though this wasn't officially true. Because of the privileges and the concessions that they had been granted. In fact, the term honorary white was coined to describe the situation of the Japanese in South Africa. The Japanese, because of strong trade links with South Africa at the time, were not, well, there was a very small Japanese resident community to begin with. Most of the people who were there were very few in number, and they were there either as diplomats or as business people. And so it was easy for the apartheid government at the time to give them some concessions and basically say that the Japanese will not be affected by laws like the Group Areas Act. And because nobody could tell the difference between a Japanese and a Chinese, the Chinese also gradually started gaining some concessions.
Now, I think you had mentioned, or your book mentions that it's a common conception that the Chinese did not suffer under apartheid as honorary whites. Why the misconception?
I think when you speak to Black South Africans, colored, Indian South Africans, the fact that the Chinese were granted concessions, and if you speak to white South Africans today, they'll say that, oh, but there was a Chinese person at my school, and the schools were racially segregated. And so there's this notion that the Chinese did not suffer, when in fact there's a whole kind of range of treatment that was afforded to Chinese, depending on their age, the region of the country, the kind of circumstances. And so when I conducted my interviews with Chinese South Africans, there was a very clear divide between the older and the younger Chinese South Africans. The older people, some of the people now who would be in their 80s, all spoke about the kind of extreme levels of oppression and discrimination that they had to suffer through. There were medical doctors who, because of the apartheid system, were permitted under a very strict quota system to attend medical school, but then during even things like autopsies would have to leave the room if the body being autopsied was a white body. So they could go back in the room afterwards and examine the parts, but they couldn't be in the room when the body was being cut open. The doctors and any professional people could never treat white people. So you could kind of work yourself down the racial hierarchy, but never above. So if you got a job in an office, you could never be, as a Chinese person, a supervisor over a white person. So there were varying levels of discrimination that were suffered. And clearly there was a difference. I mean, by the 70s and 80s, and certainly the younger people that I spoke to had no recollection of ever really being discriminated against. And so I think the perception of Chinese South Africans as honorary whites has stuck because those are the most recent memories of most of the people probably running the country or that you would speak to.